The first frost of the season had not yet touched the hills above the valley when Marshall Reed drove his old truck up the gravel path toward the eastern block of his vineyard, expecting nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of another harvest morning. What he found instead made him stop the engine halfway up the slope and simply stare. 3 women in matching jackets, each stitched with the crest of a homeowners association he had never joined, were working methodically along his fence line. One was cutting through decades-old vine cordons with pruning shears as if she were trimming a hedge. Another was pulling up the wooden boundary stakes his grandfather had driven into that soil back when Eisenhower was still president. The third was spraying bright red marking paint across the posts that had stood untouched for 60 years, humming to herself as though she were decorating a garden rather than dismantling one. Marshall stepped out of the truck slowly, the way a man does when he still cannot quite believe what his own eyes are telling him, and walked toward the fence with his boots crunching over the gravel. He had lived on this land long enough to know every rock, every irrigation line, every degree of slope in the earth, and none of what he was seeing belonged to any plan he recognized. The woman with the shears did not even look up right away. When she finally did, she smiled the practiced, patient smile of someone who deals with confused strangers for a living, and she said, in a tone that suggested she was doing him a favor, that this stretch of land was now under the jurisdiction of the association, and that maintenance crews were simply bringing it up to community standard. Marshall asked, quite calmly, where her permit was. She laughed, a short, bright laugh, and told him that permits were not necessary for association business, because the association did not need anyone's permission to manage its own property. What none of the 3 women understood in that moment was that the vineyard beneath their boots had never belonged to any homeowners association, that the deed on file at the county recorder's office predated their entire subdivision by more than 4 decades, and that every motion they made was being captured in high resolution by 6 cameras mounted along the ridge, each one already streaming to a hard drive in Marshall's study. Marshall had bought this parcel of land in wine country the same year he came home from his final deployment, back when the rolling hills west of the highway were still empty, grazing land, and the nearest neighbor was a mile down the road. He had planted his first vines by hand, learned the rhythms of pruning and irrigation from an old Italian farmer who had since passed, and built a life that asked for almost nothing from the world except quiet mornings and honest work. He had no children, no partner sharing the property with him, no complicated family politics tangled up in the land. It was simply his. In the plainest and most legally uncomplicated sense a piece of land could be someone's, and he preferred it that way. Neighbors on the older side of the ridge knew him as a steady, unassuming presence, a man who waved from his truck and kept to himself, someone who had never once been the subject of gossip in 30 years of living there. Over the decades, Marshall had watched the valley change around him in ways both welcome and strange. The 2-lane road below his property had been widened twice. The little roadside stand where he used to sell excess fruit had given way to a proper tasting room he built himself out of reclaimed barnwood, and the handful of neighboring ranches had slowly been sold off, one after another, to developers eager to carve the open land into subdivisions with names that sounded like they belonged in a wine catalog rather than a housing brochure. Marshall had resisted every offer that came his way, some of them generous enough to make lesser men reconsider, because the vineyard was never simply a piece of real estate to him. It was the place where he had rebuilt himself after years overseas, where the rhythm of pruning in winter and harvesting in autumn had given his life a structure he badly needed when he first came home, and no amount of money had ever seemed worth trading that for. That changed only after the new development broke ground 3 years earlier, a cluster of large stucco houses arranged around cul-de-sacs, with names like Vineyard Crest Court and Harvest Ridge Lane, streets that borrowed the language of wine country without any of its history. With the development came a homeowners association, and with the association came Diane Pemberton, a woman who had moved from a gated community 2 counties over and had wasted no time making herself its president. Diane believed, with the conviction of someone who had never once been told no, that a neighborhood functioned best when everything within its borders matched a single vision, one she was more than happy to define herself. Fence heights, mailbox styles, the color of garage doors, the species of trees permitted in front yards, all of it fell under her expanding notion of what she liked to call community standard. Longtime residents on the outskirts of the new development had learned quickly not to argue with her, not because she was always right, but because being right had never seemed to matter much to the outcome of a disagreement with Diane Pemberton. More than one neighbor had pulled Marshall aside over the past year to warn him, in the careful tone people use when they don't want to be quoted, that it was easier to simply give the woman what she wanted than to fight her on principle. Stories circulated through the development the way they always do in tightly packed neighborhoods, tales of a retired schoolteacher fined repeatedly for the wrong shade of blue on her shutters, Of a young family threatened with a lien over a basketball hoop left out one weekend too long, of committee volunteers who had quietly resigned rather than continue enforcing rules that seemed to expand in scope every time Diane called a meeting. None of it had ever touched Marshall directly. Since his vineyard sat outside the development's actual footprint, and he had listened to these stories the way one listens to weather reports from another county, with mild sympathy but no sense that the storm would ever reach his own doorstep. Marshall had smiled and thanked them for the warning and gone back to his own business, because he had never had a single interaction with the Homeowners Association in 3 years, had never received so much as a letter from them, and saw no reason his vineyard, sitting outside their subdivision entirely, would ever become a subject of interest to a group of people focused on driveway pavers and approved shades of beige. He was, in that assumption, about to be proven catastrophically wrong, and the morning he drove up the hill to find 3 women in matching jackets cutting through his vines was the first sign that the boundaries he had trusted his whole life were about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. Standing at the fence line with red paint drying on the posts around him, Marshall asked the question again, more directly this time, wanting to hear an answer rather than a philosophy. Why exactly were they on his property? The woman holding the shears finally set them down against a post and introduced herself as Carol Higgins, compliance chair of the association, gesturing to the woman beside her as Renee Baxter of the landscape committee, and to the third as Judith Sanders, an enforcement volunteer who had, until that morning, spent most of her time reporting unapproved holiday decorations. Carol spoke with the calm, over-rehearsed confidence of someone reciting from a script she had memorized rather than one she understood, explaining that under the association's newly adopted community plan, this parcel fell within the association's landscaping jurisdiction, and that maintenance of border vegetation was simply part of routine seasonal upkeep. Marshall asked if she had a map showing that boundary. She did not, though she promised one existed somewhere in the association's files. He asked if she had any recorded document, any survey, anything with a county stamp on it, establishing that his land was inside their jurisdiction. Again, no, though Renee produced from a canvas tote bag a glossy, full-color rendering, the kind of image a developer hands out at a sales office, showing an idealized aerial view of the community with soft green shading extending well past where Marshall's fence actually stood. It was marketing material, not a legal document, the kind of image meant to sell homes rather than establish property lines, and Marshall told them so plainly. Carol waved a hand as if his objection were a minor technicality, insisting that everyone within the geographic footprint of the development was considered part of the association's area of responsibility, whether or not they had ever signed anything. Marshall told her, in the same even voice he had used the entire conversation, that he had purchased this land decades before their development existed, long before there was an association to belong to or not belong to. Carol only smiled at that, the kind of smile reserved for someone who thinks they've heard every excuse in the book, and told him that everybody who didn't want to comply said something like that. She turned back to her shears as if the conversation had reached a natural conclusion, and Renee resumed measuring distances along the fence with a tape measure, marking additional posts for removal. Judith continued applying red paint in long, careless strokes, humming the same tune from before, entirely unbothered by the fact that a man was standing 3 feet away asking them to stop trespassing on his land. It was at that moment, watching them return so effortlessly to their work, as though his questions had simply evaporated into the morning air, that Marshall understood this was not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself through conversation. He turned, walked back to his truck, and called the sheriff's non-emergency line, giving his address and a calm description of 3 women cutting vines and pulling boundary markers on private agricultural land. While he waited for a deputy to arrive, the 3 women did not pause their work, and in fact seemed to accelerate it, perhaps sensing that time was now a factor. Over the following 40 minutes, Marshall watched from a distance as they cut through nearly 40 meters of vine cordon along the fence, some of it representing growth that had taken over a decade to train into its current form. They pulled up 11 boundary stakes entirely, tossing them into the bed of their small utility truck, and where his drip irrigation line ran parallel to the fence, someone's careless footing or deliberate action snapped 2 junction fittings, sending water pooling uselessly into the dirt. Every motion was captured on the ridge cameras, time-stamped and clear, the kind of footage that leaves very little room for creative reinterpretation later. At one point, Carol straightened up, wiped her hands on her jacket, and remarked to the others, within easy earshot of Marshall, that they were doing important work raising the property values of the whole community, a comment she would come to regret having ever said aloud once it was played back in a courtroom months later. Renee, meanwhile, had taken out a clipboard and begun sketching a rough plan for what she called a uniform hedge line gesturing toward Marshall's mature vines, as though they were an eyesore to be corrected rather than the product of years of careful cultivation. Judith, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by the presence of a property owner watching in stunned silence, chatting instead with Renee about an upcoming holiday decoration inspection scheduled for the following week, as if cutting through someone else's vineyard were simply an errand to finish before moving on to the next item on a checklist. The deputy arrived not long after, a young officer who listened to both sides with the patient neutrality required of the job, examined the cut vines and the pulled stakes, and told the three women plainly that regardless of what paperwork they believed existed, they needed to stop working on this side of the fence immediately until ownership and jurisdiction could be sorted out through proper channels. Carol protested that this was clearly a civil matter and not something requiring police involvement, but the deputy repeated his instruction more firmly, and the women reluctantly gathered their tools, loaded the truck, and drove back down toward the subdivision, though not before Judith left one final line of red paint across a post as if punctuating her disagreement with the outcome. Marshall did not raise his voice at any point, did not chase the truck down the hill, did not do anything but stand quietly and document everything with the small camera he kept in his jacket pocket, adding still photographs to the video already recorded by his Ridge cameras. That evening he called Nathaniel Cross, an attorney who had handled a boundary dispute for a neighboring rancher years earlier and had left a strong enough impression that Marshall had kept his number ever since. Nathaniel listened to the entire account without interrupting, asked a series of precise questions about what had been damaged and what evidence existed, and told Marshall the single most important thing he needed to hear that night, which was not to touch anything. Do not repair the irrigation line yet. Do not replace the stakes. Do not clear away the cut vines, because every physical trace of what had happened that morning was now potential evidence, and altering the scene before it could be properly documented by a professional would only complicate what was otherwise, in Nathaniel's estimation, an unusually clean case. That night, after the deputy had gone and the three women had driven back down toward the subdivision, Marshall walked the fence line alone with a flashlight, cataloging the damage in a small notebook he kept in the truck for exactly this kind of purpose, though he had never imagined using it for anything so deliberate. He counted the severed cordons one by one, noted the exact number of missing stakes, and photographed the broken irrigation fittings from several angles before covering them loosely with a tarp to keep the evidence from washing out if rain came overnight. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that offered no satisfaction beyond knowing it was being done correctly, and Marshall had learned long ago that this kind of patience was worth far more in the end than any amount of righteous anger spent in the moment. Nathaniel arrived at the vineyard 2 days later, carrying a leather folder thick with documents, the kind of quiet, methodical energy of a man who enjoyed the paperwork side of his profession as much as the courtroom side. Inside the folder was the original deed to Marshall's property, dating back to a purchase recorded decades before the subdivision's developer had even acquired the adjacent parcel. Alongside it sat a full title report, clean of any liens, easements, or associations of any kind, and an old survey commissioned when Marshall first fenced the property, showing precise boundary coordinates that had never been challenged in all the years since. Nathaniel spread the documents across the hood of his car and walked the fence line with Marshall, comparing old survey markers to the current fence posts, and by the time they finished the walk, it was already clear that nothing in Marshall's paperwork suggested any portion of his land had ever fallen under any association's authority, however that authority might be defined. To settle the matter beyond any argument, Nathaniel brought in Walter Griggs, a licensed land surveyor with 30 years of experience and a reputation for testimony that held up under cross-examination. Walter arrived with a truck full of modern GPS equipment, the kind capable of pinpointing coordinates to within a few centimeters, a significant upgrade from the compass and chain methods used when the original survey had been conducted. Over the course of a full day, Walter walked the entire boundary, driving temporary markers at precise intervals and cross-referencing every point against the county's recorded parcel data. When he finished compiling his readings that evening, the result was unambiguous and, for the association, deeply unflattering. The boundary the association had been operating under, the one reflected in their glossy marketing rendering, extended nearly 80 meters past the actual legal line, cutting directly through the section of vineyard where the three women had done their damage days earlier. Word of Walter's findings reached Diane Pemberton before Nathaniel had even sent a formal letter, because Carol, rattled by the sheriff's involvement, had already reported the encounter to her superior. Diane's response, relayed secondhand through a neighbor who happened to overhear part of the conversation at a community mailbox cluster, was that she simply did not believe the surveyor's numbers, insisting there must be some error in his equipment or his methodology. When Nathaniel eventually delivered the survey findings to her directly, along with a formal notice of the property line dispute, Diane repeated the same objection to his face, telling him flatly that she did not accept the results. Walter, who happened to be present for that meeting to answer any technical questions, replied evenly that her belief in the matter was not really a requirement, since the county's own recorded parcel data confirmed his findings independently, and no amount of personal disbelief was going to move a boundary line that had been legally established 2 generations earlier. It was a small exchange, only a few sentences, but something in the room shifted after it, a recognition among everyone present except Diane herself that the ground beneath the association's confidence had just given way. In the days that followed, Diane called an emergency meeting of the association's board, though she was careful to frame it internally as a routine planning session rather than anything related to the Vineyard incident. Behind closed doors, according to accounts that would later surface, she instructed several members to delete certain email threads discussing the landscaping plan for that section of the boundary, to retrieve any printed copies of the marketing rendering that had been distributed to committee members, and to align their public statements around a single narrative, one in which the association had acted in good faith based on information it had genuinely believed to be accurate. Most of the board went along with this instruction without much resistance, eager to avoid controversy and trusting Diane's judgment, as they always had. One member of the landscaping committee, a woman named Patricia Lane, who had joined the association mainly to have a say in shared garden spaces and had never anticipated being asked to participate in anything resembling a cover-up, found herself deeply uncomfortable with the direction the board was taking. Patricia had been present for the meeting where Diane gave her instructions, and she had watched with a growing unease as colleagues nodded along to a plan that essentially asked them to erase a paper trail. Rather than comply, she quietly saved copies of every relevant email, screenshotted group text messages before they could be deleted from shared devices, and kept careful notes of what was said in the meeting itself, including the moment Diane instructed the group, verbatim, to proceed with the landscaping work first and sort out the paperwork afterward if anyone complained. Within a week, unable to shake the feeling that she was watching something genuinely wrong unfold, Patricia reached out anonymously to Nathaniel's office, and after a short conversation to establish that her information was credible, she agreed to hand over everything she had documented. The email at the center of it all, sent by Diane to the board 2 days before the incident at Marshall's fence, contained a line that would follow her through every stage of the litigation that followed. Proceed with the boundary landscaping as planned, and if the property owner objects, we can address it after the work is completed. It was, in plain terms, an instruction to trespass first and negotiate later, written in Diane's own words on association letterhead, and it would prove to be one of the most damaging pieces of evidence Nathaniel had ever been handed in a property dispute. Combined with Walter's survey, the deed, the title report, and hours of clear video footage from the ridge cameras, the case against the association had gone, in the span of about 2 weeks, from a strong claim to something approaching an open and shut certainty. Nathaniel filed the lawsuit shortly after receiving Patricia's documentation, naming the Homeowners Association and Diane Pemberton individually as defendants, with causes of action including trespass, property damage, conversion of the removed boundary stakes, and negligence in the association's failure to verify jurisdiction before authorizing physical work on land outside its control. The complaint sought compensation for the damaged vines, many of which had taken years to reach full productive maturity and represented a meaningful portion of that season's expected yield, along with the cost of restoring the irrigation system, punitive damages given the evidence of willful disregard revealed in Diane's email, and attorney's fees incurred in bringing the action. When the association's own counsel reviewed the complaint and the accompanying exhibits, word filtered back to Diane that the case was, in his professional opinion, unusually difficult to defend, though she reportedly waved off the assessment as excessive caution. Diane, according to those who knew her, seemed to operate under the persistent belief that Marshall would eventually grow tired of the dispute and let it quietly fade away, the way so many neighborhood disagreements do when one side simply refuses to escalate further. She misjudged badly the kind of man she was dealing with. Marshall had spent his career trained to be thorough and patient in equal measure, and he approached the lawsuit the same way he approached everything else on his land, with meticulous documentation and a complete unwillingness to rush toward an emotional confrontation. He kept every piece of video footage backed up in triplicate, maintained a written log of each day's developments, saved every receipt related to vineyard maintenance and irrigation repair, and worked with an agricultural appraiser to calculate, with real precision, the financial impact of losing 40 meters of mature vine cordon in the middle of harvest season. The appraiser's report, once completed, estimated losses extending across multiple future harvests, since replacement vines would need years to reach the productive capacity of what had been destroyed in a single morning. As the case moved into discovery, Nathaniel's office obtained the association's internal communications through formal document requests, and what emerged only strengthened the picture Patricia had already sketched out. Several board members, when deposed under oath, gave testimony that directly contradicted the unified narrative Diane had tried to establish. One member admitted candidly that she had raised concerns before the work began, telling Diane directly that she wasn't certain the association actually had legal standing over that stretch of land, only to be told to stop overthinking it and trust the process. Another board member, when pressed, acknowledged that Diane had explicitly instructed the group to proceed with the landscaping regardless of any objection from the property owner, essentially confirming in person what her email had already put in writing. The testimonies, taken together, painted a picture not of an honest mistake made in good faith, but of a leader who had been warned, had dismissed those warnings, and had directed her volunteers to act anyway. Nathaniel organized these depositions into a clear chronological timeline for use at trial, mapping the moment concerns were first raised internally, through the decision to proceed anyway, through the morning of the incident itself, and finally through the attempted cover-up that Patricia had exposed. Laid out end to end, the timeline left almost no room for the association to argue that it had acted reasonably or in good faith at any point in the process. During Diane's own deposition, taken over the course of a long afternoon in a conference room 3 floors above the county courthouse, she grew increasingly defensive as Nathaniel walked her through the sequence of events using her own words as a guide. When shown the email instructing the board to proceed with the landscaping work and address any objections afterward, she initially claimed she could not recall writing it. Then, when confronted with the header showing her own account and timestamp, shifted to arguing that the phrase had been taken out of context, though she struggled to articulate what context might make such an instruction sound reasonable. Nathaniel asked her, plainly, whether she had authorized volunteers to enter land she knew might not belong to the association, and after a long pause, she answered that she had believed, at the time, that the risk was minimal. It was, Nathaniel would later note in his own trial preparation, one of the more revealing admissions of the entire case, since it confirmed she had understood there was a risk at all, and had chosen to proceed regardless. Even Diane's own attorney reportedly urged her, once the depositions were complete, to consider settling before the matter reached a jury, warning her that the combination of the email, the survey, the video footage, and the internal testimony created a narrative that no defense strategy was likely to overcome cleanly. It was in this climate that the association's board, or at least the portion of it not entirely under Diane's sway, pushed for a mediation session in hopes of resolving the matter before trial. The offer they brought to the table was modest given the scope of the damage. The association would pay to repair the fence and replace the irrigation fittings, and would arrange for new vines to be planted along the damaged section, all in exchange for Marshall agreeing to drop the lawsuit entirely and sign a release preventing any future claims related to the incident. Nathaniel presented the offer to Marshall exactly as it was given, without editorializing, and Marshall declined it within the same conversation, explaining that the issue had never really been about a few damaged vines that could be replanted with enough time and money. It was about a group of people who believed their sense of authority extended beyond any actual legal boundary, who had trespassed onto private land, destroyed a portion of a working agricultural business, and then tried to conceal their own internal warnings once they realized how badly they had miscalculated. During the mediation session itself, held in a conference room at Nathaniel's office with a neutral mediator presiding, Diane sat rigidly at the far end of the table and spoke only when directly addressed, letting the association's attorney do most of the talking on her behalf. At one point, when the mediator asked whether the association was prepared to acknowledge any wrongdoing beyond a simple mistake in boundary interpretation, Diane interjected sharply that her volunteers had acted in good faith and that the entire matter had been blown far out of proportion by a property owner unwilling to be reasonable. The comment did little to help her side's position, and Nathaniel watched the mediator's expression shift almost imperceptibly, the practiced neutrality of someone who had clearly begun forming his own opinion about which party was actually being unreasonable. Marshall, seated quietly beside his attorney, said almost nothing throughout the entire session, letting the documents and the footage speak for themselves, rather than engaging in the kind of back and forth that Diane seemed to expect, and perhaps even wanted. Nathaniel relayed this reasoning to opposing counsel in only slightly softer language, and the mediation session ended without an agreement, leaving the case to proceed toward trial. The trial itself, when it finally began several months later, moved quickly given the weight of evidence Nathaniel had assembled well in advance. He opened by walking the jury through the Ridge camera footage, time-stamped and unedited, showing the three women cutting vines and pulling stakes while Marshall calmly asked them, on camera, where their authorization came from. He followed with Walter's survey findings, displaying side by side the association's marketing rendering and the actual county-recorded boundary line, the discrepancy of nearly 80 meters plain enough that several jurors visibly reacted when the two images were placed together on the courtroom screen. He then introduced Diane's email, reading the critical line aloud slowly, letting the words sit in the silence of the courtroom. Proceed with the boundary landscaping as planned, and if the property owner objects, we can address it after the work is completed. The presiding judge, Eleanor Vance, a woman known around the courthouse for a low tolerance for evasive testimony, asked Diane directly, during cross-examination, why she had believed the association possessed authority to conduct work on land it had never verified as its own. Diane's answer wandered through explanations about community standards and the general spirit of the development's original plans, never quite landing on anything resembling a legal justification, and Judge Vance's expression made clear she found the response unsatisfying. When Nathaniel's agricultural appraiser took the stand, he walked the jury through his calculations methodically, explaining how the loss of mature vine cordon would suppress yields not just for the current season but for several harvests to come, since replacement vines required years of careful training before reaching comparable productivity. The association's attorney attempted, during his own turn at examination, to suggest that Marshall bore some responsibility for the confrontation, arguing that a reasonable property owner might have resolved the boundary confusion through friendlier means before allowing the matter to escalate into litigation. Nathaniel objected to the framing, and when the judge allowed the question to stand in a modified form, Marshall answered it directly under oath, explaining that he had asked the three women plainly for their authorization before calling anyone, had waited patiently for a deputy rather than confronting them himself, and had only pursued legal action after discovering that the association's own leadership had instructed volunteers to proceed with the work, despite internal warnings that no legal authority existed. The answer, delivered without any trace of anger, seemed to undercut the defense's strategy more effectively than any objection Nathaniel could have raised, and the attorney moved on to a different line of questioning shortly afterward. Carol Higgins, called to testify about her role in the landscaping work, grew visibly uncomfortable when confronted with the footage of her own remark about raising property values, struggling to explain what she had meant by a phrase that, played back in a quiet courtroom, sounded considerably more damning than it likely had in the moment she said it. By the time closing arguments concluded, the courtroom had grown notably quiet, the kind of stillness that tends to settle in when everyone present has already reached the same conclusion and is simply waiting for the formal confirmation of it. The jury did not take long to reach its verdict, finding the association liable for trespass and property damage, and finding Diane personally liable as well for her direct role in ordering the work to proceed, despite internal warnings that the association lacked jurisdiction over the land in question. The judgment required the association to pay for the full cost of restoring the damaged vines and irrigation system, along with compensation for the multiple seasons of lost yield calculated by the appraiser, and it included a punitive damages award, specifically tied to the email evidence demonstrating willful disregard for the property owner's rights. The court further ordered the association to cover Marshall's attorney's fees in their entirety, a detail that stung the organization's already strained finances considerably more than the underlying damages themselves. Judge Vance, in delivering her ruling, noted plainly that ignorance of a property boundary might be forgivable when discovered honestly and corrected quickly, but that proceeding with destructive work after being warned internally, and then attempting to conceal that warning once the mistake became apparent, was an entirely different matter deserving of a firmer response. News of the verdict spread through the development quickly, the way news of any dramatic local dispute tends to travel among people who live within sight of one another. A noticeable number of residents, many of whom had quietly disagreed with Diane's approach to governance for years, but had never had a clear enough reason to act on that discomfort, used the moment to formally withdraw from active participation in the association or to push publicly for new leadership elections. The board that had once operated almost entirely at Diane's direction found itself reorganized within a matter of months, with several members who had given damaging testimony choosing to resign rather than face ongoing scrutiny from their neighbors. A new slate of candidates ran for the open seats on a platform explicitly built around limiting the board's authority and requiring any enforcement action to be reviewed by outside counsel before proceeding, a rule that would have prevented the entire Vineyard incident had it existed a year earlier. Carol Higgins resigned from her position as compliance chair quietly, without any public statement, and Renee Baxter, who had once sketched plans for uniform hedges along Marshall's fence, was seen at community meetings only rarely after the verdict, sitting near the back and saying little. Judith Sanders, perhaps the least central figure in the actual decision-making but no less visible in the footage that had circulated informally among neighbors, found herself the subject of some good-natured teasing at the annual Harvest Festival the following year, a reminder that small communities rarely forget the details of a story this dramatic. Diane herself stepped back from the presidency not long after the judgment was finalized, her influence over the community she had once tried so completely to control reduced to something considerably smaller and quieter than it had been. She remained in the development, by most accounts keeping largely to herself, no longer the figure whose name every new resident learned within their first week of moving in. Patricia Lane, whose quiet decision to preserve a handful of emails and text messages had done more to unravel the association's version of events than any single piece of evidence Nathaniel had gathered independently, continued serving on the landscaping committee under the new board, now operating with considerably more transparency than it ever had before. Marshall, for his part, wanted very little to do with any of the community drama that followed, and once the judgment was paid and the settlement funds arrived, he turned his attention back to the work that had always mattered most to him. He hired a crew to replant the damaged section of vine cordon, with young rootstock suited to the same soil and sun exposure as the vines that had been lost, knowing it would take a few seasons before the new plantings matched the productivity of what had been destroyed. But content in the knowledge that the land itself remained entirely his, its boundaries now more clearly and permanently established than they had ever been before. He repaired the irrigation lines properly, replaced every boundary stake with new markers set precisely along Walter's surveyed coordinates, and by the following autumn, when harvest season came around again, the fence line that had once been a scene of confusion and confrontation looked, from a distance, like nothing more than an ordinary vineyard boundary, quiet and undisturbed. On the morning of that following harvest, Marshall drove his truck up the same gravel path he had climbed a year earlier, parked in the same spot, and stepped out to look over the hillside the way he had every autumn for decades. The new vines along the once damaged section had taken root well, their young leaves catching the early light in a way that made the entire hillside look, for a moment, as though nothing had ever gone wrong there at all. He stood for a long while simply taking in the view, the rows of vines stretching down toward the valley floor, the fence posts standing straight and true along a boundary line that no one could credibly dispute any longer, the whole scene carrying the particular quiet satisfaction of land that had been fought for and properly restored. The harvest crew arrived shortly after sunrise, moving through the rows with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this work for years, and Marshall walked among them for a while before returning to the section nearest the fence, the one that had caused so much trouble the autumn before. He ran a hand along one of the young cordons, still thinner and less established than the vines beside it that had never been touched, and thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that something as simple as a fence line could become the center of so much conflict, so many hours of testimony, so much money spent on lawyers and surveyors and appraisers, all to confirm a boundary that had never actually been in question in the eyes of the law. It had only ever been in question in the mind of someone who preferred her own version of the map to the one recorded at the county office, and in the end, no amount of confidence on her part had been enough to move a line that had been settled generations earlier. Later that afternoon, as the crew loaded the last of the day's harvest into crates bound for the crush pad, Marshall walked back up toward the ridge where the cameras still stood watch over the property, the same cameras that had captured every second of the confrontation a year before. He had no particular reason to check the footage anymore, no ongoing case requiring fresh documentation, but he found himself glancing up at the small lens mounted on the post regardless, a quiet acknowledgement of the role it had played in setting things right. Some neighbors had asked him, in the months since the verdict, whether he felt any satisfaction in how thoroughly the case had turned against the association, and Marshall generally answered honestly that satisfaction was not quite the right word. What he felt instead was something closer to relief, the particular relief of a man who had simply wanted to be left alone to tend his land and had, after a long and unwanted detour through courtrooms and depositions, finally gotten his wish. Land, Marshall had come to understand more clearly than he ever had before, is not protected by fences alone, however carefully built or long-standing they might be. It is protected by records kept faithfully over decades, by patience exercised even when patience feels like the harder path, and by a legal system that, however slow it can sometimes seem, still functions when the facts are laid out clearly enough for anyone to see. When people convince themselves that their own sense of authority outweighs an actual boundary line, it is ultimately the truth, documented and undeniable, that has a way of walking them back to exactly where they belong.